Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? We're tackling a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement today, one that might not be as familiar as, say, Selma, but just as crucial. You mentioned you were interested in learning more about this era, and we're diving into the Watts Riots of 1965.
Absolutely. It's a turning point that really illuminates how the movement had to evolve. I mean, this wasn't the Jim Crow South.
Right, this is Los Angeles.
Yeah, Watts specifically.
Watts in August of 1965. So we're talking about a predominantly black neighborhood dealing with, well, the poverty is rampant, high unemployment, and really a sense of disillusionment with the whole system. And, the thing that really gets me is that this is happening after huge legal victories for the movement, like the Civil Rights Act just the year before in '64.
Right, you'd think that would be cause for celebration, a sign that things were changing. But for many in Watts, it just didn't seem to apply to their lives. Like, it was this huge disconnect.
So help me understand this disconnect. What was it about the Civil Rights Act that felt so out of touch with the realities of Watts?
Okay, so the Civil Rights Act was amazing, don't get me wrong. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, all that. And it guaranteed equal access to voting, education, public spaces. But, and this is a big but, it didn't really address the economic inequalities that were, and still are, so deeply ingrained.
I see. So even though Black Americans were finally getting the legal recognition and rights they deserved, they were still facing these huge, like almost insurmountable economic barriers.
Exactly. Imagine living in a neighborhood where jobs are scarce, the schools are underfunded, housing is substandard. Even if you have the right to vote, how much does that really change your day-to-day struggle?
Yeah, that really makes you think. No wonder there was so much frustration simmering beneath the surface, this feeling that the American dream, the one everyone talks about, was still out of reach.
Absolutely. And all of that frustration, that anger, it reached a boiling point with the arrest of Marquette Frye.
Ah, this is the incident that sparked the riots, right?
It was the catalyst, for sure. August 11th, 1965. Young black man pulled over by a white California Highway Patrol officer. Suspicion of drunk driving. But things escalated quickly. There was a scuffle, people started gathering, and the tension in the air, it was palpable.
It's interesting because we know Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Watts to try and mediate, to calm things down. But you mentioned earlier he'd had trouble quelling riots in Harlem just a couple of years before. So what do you think was going through his mind? Why Watts?
Yeah, that's a good question. King had tremendous success in the South, but the urban North presented a different kind of challenge. And from the sources we've looked at, it seems like he saw Watts as a chance to really address this growing divide between the movement's progress on paper, so to speak, and the very real frustrations of black urban communities. Like he was trying to bridge a gap.
So he gets to Watts, hoping to use his influence, his moral authority to stop the violence. Did it work?
Well, he managed to bring about a brief truce, but the riots, they flared up again. And for 6 days, Watts was engulfed in unrest. It was intense. 34 people died, over 1,000 injured, millions of dollars in property damage. This wasn't just a protest. This was a full-blown uprising. Like decades of pent-up anger and despair just exploded.
That's a lot to process, even now. To see that level of destruction, it really speaks to the depth of the pain, the desperation that people were feeling.
You're right, and it's so important to remember that these riots weren't just about a single incident. This wasn't just about Marquette Frye. This was a culmination of years, decades even, of systemic inequality. We're talking lack of opportunity, police brutality, a sense of being trapped, almost like the system was rigged against them.
I'm starting to see why you called this a turning point. It sounds like the Watts riots were a wake-up call, not just for America, but for the civil rights movement itself, like a sign that things had to change, that legal equality, while crucial, wasn't enough.
And that realization, that shift in focus, it's central to understanding the trajectory of the movement and King's own evolving views on the fight for racial justice.
Okay, so how did this experience, this confrontation with the realities of Watts, how did it change Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, one of the sources quotes him saying something really profound to Bayard Rustin, one of his close confidants. He said, "I worked to get these people the right to eat hamburgers, and now I've got to do something to help them get the money to buy it."
Wow. That's incredibly powerful. He's basically saying that rights without economic power are meaningless.
Yeah, and that shift in thinking, it's going to have a profound impact on his work moving forward.
Hmm.
It really highlights this new direction he's starting to take. And it wasn't just King who was feeling this way, right? Watts kind of sparked a broader conversation, a reevaluation almost of where the movement was headed,
Yeah.
what it needed to focus on.
So was there like pushback? I mean, some people within the movement disagreed with this shift toward economic justice.
Oh, absolutely. There were definitely some people who felt like, hold on, we're not done yet.
Yeah.
You know, we still need to achieve full legal equality, especially in the South. And they argued that bringing economics into it would just muddle the message and spread the resources too thin.
That makes sense, I guess. It's about choosing your battles, right?
Right. And at the same time, you have these other groups emerging, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And they were kind of on the other end of the spectrum, like, hey, legal reforms aren't enough. We need a more radical change, a complete overhaul of the system.
So they're the ones moving more toward this idea of black power, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their disillusionment, it was partly fueled by Watts.
Yeah.
I mean, they saw it as proof that a more confrontational approach was needed to really achieve liberation.
It's so interesting how one event can be interpreted in such different ways.
And it created this tension, you know, this internal debate about strategies and goals.
Mhm.
And then you have to remember the people in Watts, the ones who are saying, hey, this isn't even about us. Those two quotes you mentioned earlier.
Right, the ones about the Civil Rights Act not meaning anything to them.
Yeah, it just goes to show how disconnected the movement's victories in the South felt to a lot of Black Americans living in these urban centers. One resident even dismissed King's nonviolence as completely irrelevant to their situation in Watts.
I can't imagine how disheartening that must have been for King, especially after dedicating his life to nonviolent resistance.
I think it just strengthened his resolve that the movement had to expand its scope. And, I mean, we see this shift pretty clearly in his later work, especially with the Poor People's Campaign.
Okay, so remind us about the Poor People's Campaign. When was that?
1968, just a few years after Watts. And it was a direct result of his changing views. It wasn't just about racial equality anymore. It was about poverty and economic injustice for everyone.
So this is about building a broader coalition, bringing in poor whites, poor Latinos, everyone struggling economically.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical idea for the time. I mean, this is the late 60s, peak Cold War, and socialism was still considered a major threat to American values.
And yet here's King advocating for a better distribution of wealth, even hinting at his support for democratic socialism.
It was a bold move for sure, and I think it really challenged people to think differently about what true equality meant.
Can you break down what King meant by democratic socialism? I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but not everyone understands it.
Sure. Basically, it's about achieving socialist goals.
Yeah.
You know, things like social ownership, greater economic equality, but through democratic means, not revolution.
So working within the system to create a more just society.
Exactly. And for King, this wasn't just some abstract theory. He saw firsthand how poverty and economic inequality were directly tied to racial injustice.
So in his view, the fight for racial justice couldn't be separated from the fight for economic justice.
They were two sides of the same coin. And, you know, he faced a lot of opposition for this stance, even within the movement itself.
Right. You mentioned earlier that some people wanted to stick to legal reform.
Yeah, they argued that taking on too much would dilute the movement's focus. But then you had groups like SNCC who felt that neither legal reform nor economic justice was enough. They wanted a complete transformation of society.
And this is where we see that split within the movement, right? Those advocating for gradual change versus those pushing for a more radical approach.
And Watts was definitely a catalyst for that split. It brought those tensions to the surface and forced the movement to really grapple with the complexities of its own goals.
Yeah, it's amazing how one event like Watts can have these ripple effects. You know, it kind of throws everything into question and forces everyone to reevaluate where they stand.
It really does. And I think it highlights something really important that we're still grappling with today. You know, just because you achieve legal equality doesn't mean that economic opportunity or social justice automatically follow.
It's true. I mean, we're talking about this event from the 60s, but it feels so relevant to what's happening right now. You know, the conversations around Black Lives Matter, the fight for a living wage, all of that.
The parallels are undeniable. And in a way, the Watts Riots provide us with this historical framework to understand these modern movements. They show us that the fight for equality, it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process, a constant struggle.
And sometimes that struggle takes on different forms in different eras.
Exactly. But the underlying issues, they remain the same. And I think Watts really exposed those systems of inequality that we're still trying to dismantle today.
So it's not just a historical event, it's something that continues to shape our present.
Absolutely. And King's personal journey, his shift toward economic justice, it really mirrors that broader evolution within the movement as a whole.
Right. He goes from focusing on legal rights to realizing that economic empowerment is crucial for true equality.
And his experience in Watts, witnessing the devastation firsthand, hearing those voices of disillusionment, it clearly played a role in that transformation.
I mean, his ideas about redistributing wealth, his willingness to challenge the status quo, they're still inspiring activists today.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to push the boundaries to make people uncomfortable. And I think that's a legacy that continues to resonate.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on the Watts riots, what would you say is the main takeaway for our listeners? Why should they care about this event over 50 years later?
Well, I think Watts serves as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is far from over, and it challenges us to really think critically about what true equality means. It's not just about legal rights. It's about economic opportunity. It's about social inclusion. It's about dismantling those systems of oppression that have persisted for far too long.
It's a call to action, then, an invitation to continue the work that began in those 6 days of unrest.
And I think it leaves us with a really important question to consider: what would a truly just and equitable society look like? How can we work towards that vision today, inspired by the legacy of Watts and all those who fought for change?
It's definitely a conversation that needs to continue, a conversation that's more relevant now than ever. Thanks for diving into this with me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.